Good evening, everybody. And my name's Harold Paisner, for those who don't know me, and I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of my firm, Berwin Leighton Paisner, to Adelaide House. And I'm of course delighted to welcome all the Maccabeans who are here, and of course all the supporters of Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. I'd like to take this opportunity of thanking Jeremy Allen Jeremy Kelly and Hannah Allen of Ben-Gurion University Foundation, and Valerie Garston of the Maccabeans, and my PA, Tracy Borman, for all the arrangements that they've made for this evening's lecture. So thank you very much to all of you. I'd also like to say thank you to Robin Michelson, because it was Robin who suggested it would be a good idea to have a joint lecture between the Maccabeans and Ben-Gurion University Foundation. I think you have a lecture, I think, every autumn, and we were going to have a lecture anyhow about this time, so it makes a lot of sense to sort of combine the two. So thank you very much, Robin. Now, as the chair in the UK of the Ben-Gurion University Foundation, I'd be failing in my duty if I didn't take this opportunity of doing a bit of marketing. And I'm not talking about marketing for my firm, but I'm talking about marketing for Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. So if you'll indulge me for a few minutes, we've got a film just about the university and what it's up to. So if you just bear a few moments, and then I'll welcome Dr. Aridan, who I should have said actually at the beginning when I was welcoming everybody, particular welcome to Natan Aridan, who's made a special effort to be here with us tonight. So thank you very much. And I'll introduce you properly in a few minutes. Thank you.
Less than a decade ago, we finally defeated cancer. But at the same time, antibiotics have lost their potency. It all rides on nanomedicine now.
Right now we're in the middle of a revolution. From the moment the intellectual capabilities of computers surpassed our own, we crossed this technological barrier and we entered the realm of morality.
When my family moved here from Tel Aviv in 2017, I was only 9 years old, and it was still considered a pioneering act. Now, if you want to engage in research on cybersecurity or water technologies, Beersheba is a global center.
When Prime Minister Netanyahu declared Beersheba Israel's cyber capital 30 years ago, many Israelis felt that they heard it all before. But BGU embraced his role as a producer for top human capital for what was probably called Silicon Wadi. Nobody's doubting now.
The Negev was never just a location. It was a mission and a commitment. We always saw ourselves as a part of the community and aspired to be a catalyst for the development of the area, and through it, to inspire Israel and the rest of the world.
I remember when student volunteers from the university came to my high school to teach science. For me, it was a life-altering experience. It made me want to be a student, go to university, and I think that's how change begins, through the children.
And this is what Ben-Gurion University of the Negev does. It is the interface of higher education, society, government, and industry that has catapulted the state of Israel and the whole region forward.
We believe everything is intertwined. It's the synergy between fields that are seemingly not connected. Cybersecurity, robotics, medicine, alternative energy that serve as the basis for the unbelievable results we have achieved.
You could actually say that our water-related technological developments helped define the new Middle East. The ability to monitor water through microfluidic devices and the highly sustainable desalination membranes used in plants that run on photovoltaic energy were all developed here at BGU. And they have brought with them an abundance of water for the whole Middle East. This is the foundation of the constructive cooperation and peace with Jordan and the rest of the countries in our region. It has also allowed us to restore the Dead Sea and its status as one of the world's most unique natural phenomena.
target diseased cells was the key factor in defeating cancer. Since then, we have already developed the first generation of implanted nanocells that maintain our body 24/7, preventing diseases and cancers, fighting viruses, and even slowing the aging process.
Technologically, we've achieved some unprecedented breakthroughs in the last few years. Our robots are highly intelligent and they're capable of performing very complicated tasks. From helping the elderly, performing household duties, and performing dangerous jobs that keep people safe. Yet they lack one thing: feelings. See, right now we're getting very close teaching them empathy and love. But does that mean that they can also learn how to hate? Together we're developing the next generation of AI that will encompass moral human behavior. This is one of the main reasons that I decided to leave MIT and I returned to Israel. I guess dealing with these moral issues felt more natural doing it here in Israel, closer to my Jewish holy and literary sources, and closer to David Ben-Gurion's heritage.
When BGU celebrated its 50th anniversary 25 years ago, it celebrated the donors who believed in the dream. Not only did they make this beautiful North Campus possible, which doubled the university's size, but they also helped us exponentially grow our influence on the most important priorities of the global agenda. I really believe the Nobel Prize we won belongs to all of us.
Well, everybody knows that our main goal is to significantly shorten the travel time to Mars and also to increase the amount of freight that can be carried by space shuttles flying there. What most people don't know is that we are relying on the PICO satellite technology developed at Ben-Gurion University. Originally, it was developed for homeland security purposes. The PICO technology provided our teams of scientists and engineers with the means to not only go further than ever before, but to also do it faster and better.
BGU played a major role in turning Beersheba into both a Desire Metropolitan Center, recently reaching 1 million residents, and an influential technological hub.
Look at what we've created here. The wineries and farms, the high-speed rail to Eilat, the technology that emerges from Beersheba. In the words of David Ben-Gurion, the difficult we do immediately. The impossible takes a little longer. I don't think it took that long.
I think you'll appreciate from that short film that Ben-Gurion University is certainly going places, so grateful of all the support from our friends. Now, Dr. Natan
Aridan.
Sorry, what did
I'm dyslexic as well.
Forgive me. Dr. Natan Aridan is a researcher and lecturer at the Ben-Gurion Research Institute for the Study of Israel and Zionism at Ben-Gurion University, and is editor of the academic journal Israel Studies. He's been a member of the Institute since he made Aliyah from Britain in 1980, having received a grant from, of all people, the Ben-Gurion University Foundation.
It was 37 years, 11 months, and 7 days.
Well, it worked out very well. Dr. Aridan has published widely on Anglo-Israel relations, Israel-diaspora relations, and Israeli diplomacy and foreign policy. He is currently writing a book on dilemmas and critical decisions of Israel's diplomats and diaspora Jewry in lobbying support for the State of Israel between 1948 and 1973. He was a recipient of an Israel Science Foundation grant for 2012 to 2014. He appears regularly on Israeli and international TV discussing Israel-related issues. Natan has kindly agreed to answer a few questions at the end of his lecture. So Natan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
I know that you have come to a lecture on the Balfour Declaration, and I will get there in a couple of minutes. And I say that because when I give talks and when I give lectures, I normally prepare 3 or 4 lectures and decide which lecture I'm going to give at the last minute when I see the audience. And, you know, very often when I was once a school teacher, I used to keep a timetable of every class that came to my lesson. So I would know. So if they were coming from a sports lesson, I know they'd be hyperactive. If they were with a very strict teacher, I would know that I would have serious problems. And the reason why I say this, and this is about Balfour, is that my book has been published on advocacy for Israel 2 weeks ago. But before, as I said, my deep thanks to the Ben-Gurion Foundation. My theory is that Jews don't go to places, they end up in places. And I was given a grant by the Ben-Gurion Foundation, and I arrived in Beersheba to study an MA degree, which didn't exist, and then became the first student that got an MA. And the institute I work at, and this is what I call the Reshit. This is Genesis. This is the view which I call the dead centre of Stepelkar, with my British humour, Ben-Gurion's grave, the wilderness of Zin. And very often when I get depressed or I get fed up, I go and ponder and think about where I am in the world. And great religions have come out of the desert. In fact, Marxism failed, it came out of a town. But Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism came out of communion with a higher being in the desert. And great things happen in the desert. Now, the institute which I work at, people say, what do you need an institute about Ben-Gurion in the desert? And what you have seen is the most important factors about Ben-Gurion University. That I am teaching with my fellow colleagues the next generation of mayors in Israel. I taught 5 mayors. None of them have actually been caught for corruption, which is great. I have taught a few school teachers, and one of the things which is very, very important, if you take the humanities away and only have pure science, you are taking the idea of questioning and logic. And what I do with my students, we have an international school, I have students from China, from Armenia, from Britain, from all over the world, is that to ask questions. And sometimes when I get comments on what they think of my course, I took it as a compliment when one student says, I came out with more questions than the answers I wanted. And so one of the great things about being in the university is that we are a nation, still nation building. And the problems and the dilemmas, and this is relevant to today's talk, about what sort of society was Israel going to be. And when I teach about dilemmas, what were the dilemmas that faced Israel's founding fathers and mothers, because we forget about founding mothers. Who is the Jew? The question of peace with our neighbours. What sort of education, what sort of Jewish society we're going to be. These are things that Ben-Gurion had to deal with and other leaders. And so the courses that I teach, and we're looking at original documents from Britain and from America and from Israel, I try to get my students to understand the problem. If we do not know what the question is, we can't find the answer. I also want to dedicate, and I thought about this on the train on the way, and I'm saying this not to horrify you. There I was, a British immigrant going into the army at a later stage, and within 2 days I had to take body parts of a friend of mine who was burnt to death in a terrorist attack. His name was Amnon Pomerantz, who stayed a bit later in Beersheba because his daughter was ill at Soroka Hospital. And he was killed on this secular day, and his killers were released. And the reason why I say this, and this is why I'm getting to the Balfour Declaration, is that we forget what leadership is about. We forget the life and death decisions that our leaders have made. If I'm talking about Churchill, about breaking of Enigma, about whether to bring in the anti-tank, the anti-aircraft to Coventry, and know that because you're not going to defend them, thousands of people are going to die for a greater effort. This is what leadership is all about. And many of you, or all of you here, are in professions when you are having to make decisions about morality and having to think about the greater good. We often forget this because we know what the end result was. We know what the end of the Balfour Declaration was, or we know the Second World War. But people like Winston Churchill didn't know when the war was going to end. And people like Ben-Gurion didn't know when the War of Independence was going to end. And so therefore the decisions that these people made, but also other in a democracy, these are things which are very hard. The journal which I edit, Israel Studies, which has now become the leading journal in the world on area studies. And when it was mentioned that I was on the media, coming from Britain, for some reason I was selected as being the expert on British politics. In the last 15 months, I have appeared 37 times on the radio and the television. The last time was, but once, was when Diana, the 20th anniversary of Diana, and when I heard that the Duchess of Cambridge was pregnant, I said to my wife, I said, I wonder how long it'll take Israel Radio to interview me about her pregnancy. Within 2 minutes, I was interviewed about the pregnancy. I won't tell you what I said. Anyway, so these are some of the pictures about Brexit, and I always wear my Ben-Gurion tie, which was given to me in university. They wouldn't give it to me, so people in Chicago, I was with Trump. I'm not doing this for myself, but with Doris May and with the Queen, because the Duke of Edinburgh had announced that he was going to retire, and with Churchill, etc. And in 1986, the centenary of Ben-Gurion's death, the House of Commons approached me to try and find where Ben-Gurion lived, because Ben-Gurion lived in London, and he was during the Blitz, and it really affected his understanding of British society. And I found his home in Maida Vale, and they put up a blue plaque. It's in Warrington Crescent, and I actually went to go and ask the people whether the property value had gone up, and they refused to say anything. Now, I teach diplomacy, and this is I'm working in now the Balfour Declaration. There's a certain amount of cynicism that, of course, diplomacy is the art of letting someone else have your way. It's also called a marriage. What I think is important for us to understand is that, and some of history does not repeat itself, but historians repeat each other. Because if we can't find fault with someone else, who's going to add anything to the Balfour Declaration, etc. And the other quote, which I think is very, very important and is certainly relevant, is that there is still no solution as to how to divide the former Ottoman Empire after 99 years. So this is the letter. I'm going to start off with at the end. This is the letter which I'm going to analyze, and I'm going to give my take on it and be very happy to answer questions. November the 2nd, 1917. It was a Friday, and as I mentioned, the Fridays are very, very important when you want to make an announcement, because people read newspapers, people listen, especially Jewish people, on Friday before the Sabbath. And this letter, which there are a number of historians, those people who do not want Israel to exist, who try to change the wording of this letter. You can't change history. People are trying to give different meanings to what was happened. People don't like the fact that Israel was created. Too bad. Sorry. So Lord Rothschild was sent a letter I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government. And what's important here, which I'm analysing this, is that many people promise things. You know, it could be Natan Aridan from the government. Who do I represent? But this comes from His Majesty's government. But more important, the following declaration of sympathy, and this is a question, there's no commitment. Sympathy is something we can all do without committing to anything. With Jewish Zionist aspirations. Now, if it was only Jewish aspirations, the yearning to go to Zion, fine. But just within 20 years of the creation of the Zionist movement, the British government, the most important imperial power in the world, has recognized a political movement. This was a tremendous success. And it's been submitted to and approved by the cabinet. Now, being a historian, many people make mistakes as historians. Natan Aridan wrote this memorandum, and all of a sudden you discover no one actually read it. But it appears on record. The Prime Minister didn't allow Asquith, for instance, the Prime Minister before Lord George, refused to allow anyone to circulate memoranda to anyone. So we know that this comes directly from the government, and it was discussed and approved. And then we have His Majesty's government view with favour, whatever that means, okay? The establishment in Palestine of a national home. No one knew what Palestine meant. Palestine has never been an independent country. And when I teach my courses, I ask my students, I said, what is Eretz Israel? What is the land of Israel? And people say, it's obvious. But I was once in a debate with a very right-wing politician, and I produced 38 maps of what the borders were in Eretz Israel according to the Bible. And I said, which Eretz Israel are you referring to? Because the borders expanded and they contracted according to the diplomacy and realpolitik of the day. But the other thing is, it says in Palestine, no one actually knew what it was, of a national home. It's not the national home, it's a national home. Okay? Later on, the Soviets had Azerbaijan as an autonomous republic for the Jews, so it's not the national home. But the other thing is, for the Jewish people, Jews have been recognized as a people. When I was at university and we were banned from meeting on campus because of the UN resolutions, some Arab students who I had issues with said, Natan, there's no Jewish people, there's no Jewish nation, but you don't look Jewish. And I said, you're giving me attributes of a race or a nation. And then it said to use their best endeavors, and I discovered last night that best endeavors, we call it in the law, is that it's commitment, that this isn't a legal document. To facilitate the achievement of this object, and as I always tell people, the first part is, yes, you can make an omelette, the second part is, you can't break the eggs. Because nothing should be done in which pay prejudice. So how do you work out prejudice? How do you work out to what extent non-Jews, there were only 58,000 Jews in the whole of Palestine. Of course you're going to offend and upset and anger those people who are the vast majority, etc., etc. So Arthur Balfour. Now, as I said, ever since the Balfour Declaration, and we have an honoured historian here who's published on the Balfour Declaration with the Jewish publications of Jewish JPIA, is it? Jewish Policy. JPIA, which does excellent work. There's a controversy. Why did Britain make the offer? Very often we don't ask the question. And did it betray its prior promise to the Arabs? So what I basically would like to explain, that the fact of the matter is that during war, everyone makes promises, very often they don't keep. Everything is done to win a war. That is the number one object, is to win. And you do it through intelligence, you do it through espionage, you do it through soldiers on the ground. Everything is done to win the war. So the American President Wilson issues his 14 points about the right of self-determination for peoples to have their own countries, providing that they're not part of the British Empire, the French Empire, the Belgian Empire, the Dutch Empire, etc. But this was to help groups to rise up against the Ottomans. And the other thing is, which other people don't mention, and I'm talking about there is no one answer in history. There are different interpretations, but there is no document which shows in any way that the British promised anything to the Arabs of having an independent state. Independent fiefdoms, yes, but not a state. And did the Arabs of the region see themselves indigenous as Palestinians? The answer is no. So the idea of saying that the Balfour Declaration was terrible because it discriminated against and Palestine was promised twice. The British never promised anything to the Jews. It did everything to facilitate, and it certainly didn't promise anything to the Arabs. Now, there are a number of books on the Balfour Declaration, and some of you might have read Christopher Sykes, who wrote, "Nobody knows why the Balfour Declaration was made. Many reasons have been deduced, too many to allow belief in any single clear one." And this actually reflected many interpretations of the Balfour Declaration, because there were no documents published. It's only when Harold Wilson promised that there would be a 30-year rule on documents, most of the documents were never published, which reminds me that when I knew that I was an Israeli, sorry if I'm going off on a tangent, when I went to go and interviewed Sir Harold Beeley, who was Bevin's number 2 in the foreign ministry, and I went to go and interview him in the Reform Club, and how stupid I was as an ex-British person to not turn up in a suit. So there I was on Pall Mall, went in with my £3.17 in my Leeds University bank account, buying a suit which cost hundreds of pounds, but then only discovering that Harold Beeley had very severe Parkinson's with a cup of coffee, and I said, please God, do not spill this coffee on my jacket, because I won't get the money back. But the reason is very interesting. He said, we never did this, and we never did this. And I said to Sir Harold, I said, is this your signature? Because I brought in the documents. He said, oh my God, they're published. They promised that they wouldn't publish it for 100 years, etc. So we can only look at facts, but even then documents are important. Even though I teach diplomacy, I always stress to my students that all diplomats, when they write documents, they do so because they're writing to their superiors. And you are not going to write something which is critical of your boss, who is a ministry of the colonies or minister of the foreign affairs. You have to be very, very careful as to what you report. So you have to be very, very careful as the facts on the ground. Now, as I said, the Arab Summit in 2016, they launched a campaign to delegitimize the Balfour Declaration, of which to actually sue the British government to force an apology as to what happened in 1948. Now, we're going through a period of taking down statues and other places, but what's interesting is that no one is getting the British to apologize about massacres of the Mau Mau or other indigenous people or the Algerians in France. Britain is the only country in which a campaign is to try, and it's going through international courts, by the way, at The Hague, to actually rescind and to apologize for something of which I will try to prove to you, the British were not duped into issuing the Balfour Declaration. They went at it and actually initiated the Balfour Declaration. One of the experts on the Balfour Declaration, a man called James Renton, told at a university lecture, he thought that the declaration misconceived, ill thought through. Okay, so people might have made mistakes. Had led to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Everyone is looking for the original sin. of what happened in 1948. And what I think is important is to actually look at certain facts. Now, I'm not going to go too much into details, but if you are now running a war and you do not know when it's going to end, okay, we're all very clever. We know it ends on the 11th of November 1918. No one had any idea of when it was going to end. If you're Prime Minister, you set to work various groups, get them to work on a solution, such as in the Second World War. Do we go through Sicily? Do we attack North Africa? Do we open up a second front in Europe? And one of those groups is going to succeed. That is what you do, and that's what scientists do in a laboratory. What scientists often do in a laboratory is try to prove that X doesn't help to cure Alzheimer's. And as a result of mistakes, then you discover insulin and other things. So very often when people set about experiments, what you try to do is to prove that X doesn't help. And it might take you 4 years. So there were, one of the things which is underestimated, that in the government there were competing groups in the government who were competing with each other about what to do with the Ottoman Empire. And what happens is you have Chaim Weizmann, who is one of the great heroes of the Balfour Declaration. And one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves is, to what extent do politicians, leaders, create facts? And without a play on words, there was chemistry between Chaim Weizmann, who was the chief scientist in the Ministry of Munitions, and Lloyd George, who later on became a Prime Minister. And what I think is very, very important, and as I said, was that in 1916, Christa de Sykes came to an agreement with Picot of France to how to divide up the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire had been crumbling for many years, and there was a sphere of influence. So the blue zone would be the French area, which, by the way, included the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights was part of the French mandate, by the way. And then you had red zone, and then you had various issues of influence. But what happened was that, you know, the idea that you can just carve up a place. But what happened is that in the 2nd of December 1916, Asquith, the Prime Minister, the Liberal Prime Minister, he is forced out, and Lloyd George, David Lloyd George, or Dafydd, in Welsh, David, he comes to power, and there's a shift as to what is going to happen. Britain is losing the war. We often think of happy endings. It wasn't. If you can think of a 24-hour clock, it was only in April, May 1918, a few months before, that Britain was actually winning the war. Britain was losing the war. The French were mutinying. The French army, hundreds of soldiers were being shot on the front for desertion. The Russians were going through a revolution and another one on the way. And the British were on their own, and their major fear, which in fact happened, was that if the Russians have an agreement to leave the war, then the Germans, instead of fighting on two fronts, would be able to concentrate all their troops fighting against the British. As long as Russians were being killed, less British people were being killed. And so one of the things which was very important in Lloyd George's view was, yes, the French are allies, but as you know, the 100 Years' War hasn't ended, really, between Britain and France. And the British policy was to do everything to stop French influence. Now, very often people write, and I'm not trying to dismiss all sorts of ideas. People say the reason why the Balfour Declaration, because Lloyd George was a Christian and there were Christian philo-Semites, etc. But when it really comes down to it, in no way am I in any way insulting this. But policy decisions are not based on whether this happens. If you actually look at the decisions, none of this played any part of it. So there was a sympathy. There was a yes, you have access. Yes, yes. We the Welsh are part. We're the children of Israel. And if you know about Welsh Methodism, they know the history of the Old Testament very often more than Jews do. And notice, by the way, Catholics do not teach their children about the Old Testament. Protestants do, and it's a very, very important difference. And so the idea that because of Britain wanted to, because of Christianity, etc., that wasn't the reason. And Balfour, which I didn't put into the slide here, was an excellent politician, but in 1902, when he was Home Secretary, there was a serious problem with too many Jews coming to this country as immigrants. And the leadership, the Jewish leadership, didn't particularly like a new change of leaders. So who did they invite to give the parliamentary commission of what to do with the influx of immigrants? They didn't call it Jews. In the end, it came up as the Aliens Act. They brought Theodor Herzl. Balfour brought Theodor Herzl to the British Parliament, who had an idea of what to do with all these Jews who didn't necessarily have to leave Eastern and Middle Europe, but to go to Palestine instead. And it was also Balfour who suggested at the peace conference after the First World War that the Americans should have a mandate over Palestine. So one of the things we need to understand is, yes, Weizmann had a very important influence. He had a very, very important influence. He had access. And that's something which is very important, that we all know. And many of you as lawyers and other people know, having access doesn't mean what we call vitamin P in Hebrew, protectia. But it means that if you ring up and the secretary would answer. I had a friend in Israel and he was French and his name was Justice. But every time he wanted to pressure someone, he would say, Justice so-and-so is on the phone. And it was immediately answered because they thought that he was a judge, etc. So, yes, Weizmann has access. But if the British did not want to help the Jews go back to Palestine, Weizmann wouldn't have succeeded. And in 1915, Lord Samuel, who was then Minister of Home Affairs, wrote 2 memoranda about suggesting that the Jews should be able to go back to Palestine and the British to help them. It fell on deaf ears. It really, no one was interested. So timing is very important. Now the idea of this magic, the idea that the Jews are so powerful that they can whirl all these politicians is something which is, I think, is part of anti-Semitism. And which I wrote in my latest book, that the idea that somehow or other the Jews control everything in Washington. So if you're good to the Jews, you can have the ear of the president. And Jews had actually used this for their own interest, but then it has a boomerang, and as someone once said, I forgot how to use a boomerang, but then it came back to me. And one of the things that very often when you over-exaggerate your influence, you play into your enemy's hands. So one of the questions that we need to ask is, why was it in February 1917? If there was religious support, if there was an understanding, etc., how come all attempts by the Zionist leaders to influence the politicians fell on deaf ears? And that's a question that people don't ask. Why in February 1917? Because if the Jews had so much control, why wasn't this happening? And it had to do with external factors. It had to do with internal factors. So very often if you look at governments in Britain, especially in the Conservative Party, you had Eurosceptics, etc., etc. And when I wrote my first book, which I dealt with the British Labour government after the Second World War, and Nye Bevan, the architect of the National Health Service, made great speeches in government about pro-Israel. But it wasn't because he was pro-Israel. He hated Bevin. And so therefore you have to understand that if so-and-so is for something and someone I'm going to be against, or I'm going to be for if someone's against, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the greatest supporters. You have to understand the internal politics, and very often we Israelis don't understand. We're very ignorant sometimes about the mechanisms that go on, because not everyone is, Israel isn't the center of everything. There are business concerns, there are different constituencies, etc. Now, when they use the idea of national home, this is important. The word national home had no legal significance. It was never used before. A home, is that a reservation? Is this a place? I mean, what does the word home mean? When Herzl wrote his book, Judenstadt, the word Stadt in German could be state, like a country, but it could also be a German state, like Bavaria, or it could be an American state, like Washington, or it could be California. So the Jews themselves didn't demand a state. But what was important was that the word home, no one actually meant. And as I always tell my students in every lecture I go to, is in the Hebrew we do not have any differentiation between the word house and home. House is bait, or if you say I'm going home, habaita. Because everything in Judaism is collective. We're coming up to Yom Kippur. It's not I have sinned, please forgive me. It's everything upon us. It's basically not the individual, it's about collective rights, etc. And first of all, no one actually knew Palestine. So when the Zionists were talking about home in Palestine, until 1919, the Zionist movement never defined what Palestine was. And when I debate my academics, friends, colleagues, and maybe not so much friends, Palestinian Arabs, and they say Palestine, etc., I said there will not be a state of Palestine until you define the borders. It's not enough to say 67 borders. You have to define and negotiate with Israel of where those borders are going to be. So the word Palestine has still not been defined by the Palestine national movement. If you ask, they will say, yes, it's over here, but when you see maps of the Palestine Authority, the whole of Israel today is part of the Palestine map. It doesn't go after 67. Now, as I said, I talked about Jewish power, and what happens in the summer of 1917 is it's chaos. As I said, Britain is losing the war. Lenin is trying to persuade the Germans to allow him to go and leave the war. And what within the internal debates within the British government, this is something that very few people have written about, is that there were serious debates as what are we going to do about the breakup of the Ottoman Empire? And we have to get there first, we're the British. Why? Because we're in Egypt. And we need to do it before the rains come in the winter. We are in a position to invade Palestine. But we need to do it. But we need an excuse. Just as much as the war against Iraq, the United States is one of the only wars in which we're still trying to find the reason why there was a war. I often tell my students that there are 710 reasons for the war. Sorry. And whereas, and I'm saying this not politically, we in Israel are still trying to understand what we do with the victory of 67. We still haven't worked it out. And as Levi Eshkol once said, and forgive me for his sexist comment, he said he liked the dowry but had a problem with the bride. So you have in Israel, we've won the consensus, we have Eretz Israel, but what do we do with 2 million Palestinians? We don't want to be South Africa. So one of the important things is to understand that the idea of occupying, conquering Palestine since 1517, when the Ottomans were in power. Now, the other thing which is very important is that the Germans and the French were also going to issue a declaration in favor of a state. The word state, if you look at the French documents, Jules Gambon, the French foreign minister, the French were going to promise the Jews, and the British knew about this, and they wanted to get in first. The other thing is that the idea of Jewish power and the idea that if you manage to persuade the Warburgs, who owned all the banks in the United States, etc., and if you do something good for the Jews, then America will help. And people forgot that the vast majority of Jews in the United States during the First World War did not support Britain. And it wasn't because they were anti-Britain, because Britain was on the side of Russia. How can you support a side which had pogroms, rapes, murders, all sorts of things, and a large number of Jews who had immigrated from Austria and Germany, who naturally would support Germany and Austria. So, as I mentioned, that the Americans hadn't forgotten that the British had burnt down the White House in 1812. The Americans were very skeptical about British imperialism. But if the British were going to do something which was totally altruistic, it had nothing to do with their war efforts, but to help these poor Jews, and that's what they were doing, it would be able to deflect the criticism and also the belief, because there are a number of Jews in power in the government, the first government in Russia, that doing something for the Jews would keep Russia in the war. So Weizmann, as I said, was suggesting to get in there first. And there were arguments. Originally, Balfour wasn't in favour of issuing a declaration, etc., etc., but the activists who were in a serious debate with the more moderates decided that they needed to work on this. And so you have, in the Board of Deputies in Britain, the myth that somehow or other, people were pro-Zionist. Britain is a great country for allowing free speech. So when Herzl publishes his idea of the Jewish state, he's publishing the Jewish Chronicle, okay, next to an editorial in font 1.5 by the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, Myers, about why Zionism was a deadly sin and no one from Britain should support Zionism. But the important thing was that this was the Board of Deputies. There was a great discussion about whether there should be a declaration, etc. And the British were saying to the Zionists, hey, come back to us quicker. We're waiting because we want to issue a declaration. And the Zionists were arguing amongst themselves about whether you should do this and whether you should do this. And it took a great deal, and they had all the wording, etc. So these are various important aspects of what pushes the declaration. And Weizmann did play a part by saying, listen, if you don't issue the declaration, it's going to be too late, and the Germans will get there before you, and the French. Now, the key issue in the history of the Balfour Declaration is the significance and implications of the reciprocal relations between the radical policy led by Lloyd George and the Zionist policy promoted by Weizmann. And as I said, to understand that the whole idea of issuing a declaration was part of various efforts amongst politicians, etc. The Foreign Office set up a Jewish propaganda bureau. The Germans also did the same thing, and also the French. Now, the reason why there was a Balfour Declaration was because Britain wanted to win the war. But there was a sentiment of helping Jews, because the idea of promoting and business and academia, etc. But I think this is one of the most important things. Now, just finishing off soon, what's important and what I do with my students is very often the answer, if someone is brilliant at mathematics and only writes down the answer, they fail the exam. You have to explain how you got from A to Z. And that's important. And this is something that we miss out today. Because who keeps drafts? I have, in the archive which I work in at Stephen Care, we have drafts of the Declaration of Independence, and should it be Almighty or God? and then they compromised on Rock of Israel, etc., etc., all the wording. And this is fascinating. And it's fascinating when you learn Torah, Talmud, etc., is the argument about what goes in and what goes out and how wording has changed. And I can send this. Now, what's important is originally they talked about the reconstitution of the Jewish state. I am absolutely convinced, and I'm not naive, and we often forget it, that the Jews were independent in their state, at least autonomy, twice. This isn't the people going to South Africa to colonize it, or India. We didn't change names in Israel to call it Boston or New England. We had names originally in the Bible. And so what Israel, the Jewish state was reconstituted because we had been there before. And one can argue about other things. And so all the wording goes in, and I want to finish. There was opposition within the British jury, especially about Edwin Montagu. But on the 31st of October, they decided that they were going to change. If you want, I can use original documents, and these are the people who were considered to look at it for various. Hankey, who was the Secretary of War, and when Montagu was out of Britain, he was on India. So then they had a vote. Okay, so it reminds me, by the way, and I'll be finishing within 2 minutes. The first time and the last time the UN ever sent soldiers to fight in a war was during Korea, the war in Korea. I hope the first and the last war in Korea. And what happened was that the Soviets boycotted the Security Council. And when they left the room, then there was a vote, and there was no opposition to sending in troops. So never leave a board meeting when there will be a vote. So what I basically want to do over here is just to summarize certain things, and that is that the importance of the Balfour Declaration and the League of Nations, because the League of Nations was a legal document, lays in the international recognition of pre-existing natural, historical and legal rights of the Jewish people to their home, in which there had been a continuous Jewish presence throughout the centuries. The official acknowledgement by the international community of the Jewish people's historical right to the land is further emphasized by the language used in the League of Nations mandate decision. The Palestine Land of Israel mandate specifically calls to reconstitute the national home of the Jewish people. People don't like the fact that there is a state of Israel. People are trying to find an excuse about why there was a state of Israel. But basically, it was the British government that initiated it for its own legitimate reasons, as to all countries which have a logical foreign policy. But immediately after the Balfour Declaration, with the British military rule, they tried to do as much as they could to stop the Jewish home from becoming too large, because understandably they had their own interests with the Arab world. But to portray it, and this is why I'm finishing, to portray that these poor ministers were duped by this Jewish conspiracy is very often what people are doing about American Jewry. And it's insulting to the American people, because 75% of all Americans, when polled, they might have, and they do have, differences about Israel's policies on the West Bank, but 75% of American citizens support aid to Israel. And a similar number of members of the Congress and the Senate, irrelevant whether they have a Jewish constituency or not, also support it. And even with Eisenhower, who's critical, every president, to insinuate that there's this Jewish conspiracy that are acting as marionettes with puppets is insulting the intelligence of British citizens, British politics, and American politics. People do not like the fact that there is a state of Israel. You can't go and rewrite the history in order to try and justify anything else. Thank you. From Chaim Weizmann, independence is never given to a people, it has to be earned, and once earned must be defended. Thank you.
Natan, thank you very much indeed. Now we've got a few minutes for some questions, so
right.
Please go ahead.
Yes.
You mentioned quite rightly in the beginning about the actual declaration, and that the writing was changed to be much softer, with sympathy for national Jewish home, and to begin with it was much tougher. I've read that the reason why that was changed, and you just touched on it briefly, was to do with Lord Montagu. There was a group of people in Britain at that time that was so anti-Israel, or the idea of a Jewish home, because they saw it as a Jewish ghetto. And we were British, and we just happened to be Jewish. So internal politics was fighting this document that was carrying on at the time. So it's an interesting thing to
It's
observe.
absolutely interesting that very often people underestimate, and people in Israel say, of course you have to have a self-hating Jew. Apart from sharing the same mistress with Asquith, Venetia Stanley, who later converted to Judaism, interestingly enough, that Montagu was also Minister of India. And people forget this. You know, to have a pro-Jewish declaration means that you're going to have unrest in Muslims in India, and this is going to cause problems. Montagu called the Balfour Declaration an anti-Semitic document to quote, "All our lives we've been fighting to leave the ghetto, now you are forcing us back." And this was a feeling, and by the way, I don't know if you've noticed this, British Jewry has never called themselves British Jewry. It's always Anglo Jewry. It's different than any other definition, because the idea is the Anglo, it's the acculturation, that we are proud Jews and we are proud British people, etc., etc. So yes, certainly this was true, but amongst Montagu's family, by the way, the myth was that he was an assimilated Jew isn't correct. In their family they had a will that if any of their children did not carry on Orthodox Judaism, they'd be cut out. Lily Montagu, who founded Progressive Judaism, lost out on £1.7 million, which is a lot of money in those days. So this wasn't someone who was assimilated, but certainly the idea of, by the way, similar in America, if you ever want to go to synagogue, to a shul, and you see the name called temple, then you know it's not an Orthodox synagogue. Because the temple in the Reform movement in Germany and America was that a temple was now in America. They didn't need messianic aims. They didn't need to have this yearning to go to Eretz Israel. So if you ever want to go and pray, and you hear and you learn that any synagogue which calls itself temple is not Orthodox. Thank you. Yes.
I think it was 25 years ago, perhaps the 75th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, that the Jewish Museum held a special exhibition, and the letter was on display. I was there the first evening, and various ambassadors had been invited, and I happened to be standing next to the Israeli ambassador, and he was telling me that his father, it might have been his grandpa, but I think he said his father, and his uncles or his great-uncles were actually negotiating with the Germans contemporaneously with Weizmann negotiating with the British government. And I would be very interested to know how far the Jewish people in, presumably in Palestine at the time, how far they got with the Germans, but they got a promise out of them.
Well, first of all, it's a very good question.
If they won the war, they would set up.
Very good question. Ben-Gurion goes to fight in the British Army. Shertok goes to fight in the Ottoman Empire. And it wasn't, to actually be working against the interests of Turkey and German. More than 300 Jews were sentenced to death. for working with the opposition. My answer to you is go to the National Theatre and see the play Oslo. Because what happens there is you have two negotiating teams. One is sent to Washington to pretend to negotiate. All the press are looking at that, but the real negotiations are going on in Oslo. In other words, you hedge. It's called hedging. So you work with the Jews in France, you work with the Jews in Germany, you work with the Jews in Britain. Everyone's a winner. Thank you. Yes.
I think there's this gentleman over here first.
Okay. Hi. Yes.
Why do we not place equal emphasis, or indeed more emphasis, on the San Remo Treaty as we do of the Balfour Declaration? I would suggest that it's probably the Magna Carta for the foundation of the State of Israel, and encompasses, as you know, the Balfour Declaration.
Very good question. The year after the Magna Carta, if I'm not mistaken, King John died. And lost the crown jewels. But certainly San Remo, for other people, you have various conferences after the First World War. So you have Versailles, which is to do with Europe, and then you have another conference to do with the breakup of the Balkan Empire. What happened? For the first time in 2,000 years, a great power was going to help the Jews return to the land of Israel. The last time that happened was Cyrus, Koresh. This was messianic. This was a government who was going to help Jews reconstitute themselves. It was because of the Balfour Declaration, it was because the British had conquered Palestine, that basically meant that it was a fait accompli. And certainly San Remo was the actual issuing of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was a international legal document, as it was, by the way, with the recognition of Resolution 181 on the 29th of November, which Palestinians, Arabs forget. Whether they like it or not, the vast majority of states in the world called for establishment of a Jewish and Arab state. And the fact that Jordan, and I say this not in any way with right-wing politics, I never have read anywhere where it talks about occupied territory of Jordan, which illegally annexed the West Bank on the 24th of April 1950. It never appeared on the maps as disputed territories, administered territories, or illegal territories, but you're right. But the Balfour Declaration paved the way. It took 5 years for it to actually have international recognition. Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yes.
To what extent, if any, do you think that the Balfour Declaration was issued as a means of bolstering the Yishuv, because the Yishuv, to an extent, was anti-British at 1917, and for example, the Aronson family in Yaakov had encountered a lot of resistance to their work for the British. Do you think the Balfour Declaration was intended to bolster support for Britain?
I don't think so. The fact is that Jews, if you look at Maimonides, the Rambam, Jews are instructed to be loyal to the governments in which they live under. They want to be equal citizens. You pay taxes. You have Jews being conscripted to the German army, to the Ottoman army in Britain, and you have Christians, onward Christian soldiers, all fighting each other in Europe. Had nothing to do with that. 58,000. There were 85,000 Jews at the beginning of the First World War. 58,000 remained. About 10,000 Jews died of typhus. A large number of people like Ben-Gurion were exiled. They had no clout, and the vast majority of the Jews were religious. They had been cut off by the Rothschilds. They were living on aid, and this actually set up the Joint Distribution Committee in Turkey. The Jews were starving. Jews had no influence whatsoever in Palestine. But the idea was trying to understand where the winds were blowing. It was treason, and as I said, you don't do it. I mean, the fact of the matter was that Muslims, they were not anti-Semitic. The Ottomans, as long as the Jews played by the rules. By the way, one of the few things that we forget, and I'm saying this because I'm not going to argue who controls Jerusalem, the Jews were a majority in Jerusalem as early as 1845. This is 50 years before the Zionist movement. There were more Jews than there were Christians or Muslims. By 1876, there was 52% of the whole population of Jerusalem were Jews. And yet, if you look at the narrative today, the Jews have invaded, whatever. So they played no part whatsoever. And Weizmann didn't live in Palestine. Most of the Jewish leaders didn't live in Palestine. And as I said, why rock the boat? Okay. Yes.
Balfour today is not regarded as the most illustrious of politicians in the UK, and I believe he doesn't actually have a monument or a statue in the UK, which is.
I just wanted to interrupt you something while I carry on the question. I once heard, pay no attention to, Sibelius said this, the composer, pay no attention to critics. Whenever have you seen a statue in memory of a critic?
All right.
Carry on.
Balfour did go on to become Prime Minister, and he's also the recipient of the expression "Bob's your uncle," because
I thought that was with Lloyd George.
Was it Lloyd George?
Well,
because I thought his uncle was Lord Sainsbury.
Yes,
Salisbury.
yes.
Salisbury.
Yes.
How is Balfour recognised or considered in Israel and the Balfour Declaration today?
Well, every street has a name of Balfour. He's a hero. And if you look at the Israel's independence, it talks about, there's a logic of the Zionist Congress, and then it talks about Bet b'November. In Hebrew, we talk about Kaftet b'November, the 29th of November. It's written Bet, the 2nd of November. He was a hero, but he wasn't a very effective politician, by the way, even though he had been a prime minister. And the fact of the matter is, that's what people remember, and it's very, very important. He wrote the letter, and that is what people will remember. And there were, by the way, in Iraq, 300 families made Aliyah in 1918.